Okay, today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim daf Samach Zayin. As you will see, the second part of today's daf has quite a complicated back and forth. We're actually going to start learning some Mishnayot of Masechet Kinim. It's a bit of a sneak preview into what is waiting ahead for us when we get to that Masechet, which is a Masechet just of Mishnayot. It's all about pairs of birds in the temple. That's going to be the second half of today's daf, and for that there's a presentation which I hope will be very helpful in explaining the cases. Okay, but first we're going to go back and understand Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Eliezer. Our structure today is quite simple. We're going to have a lot of back and forth between Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Eliezer. We're going to continue the back and forth we had yesterday. We're going to then have a Braita, which has some more back and forth arguing of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua. I don't want to give away the punchline at the end of that, so I'll leave that as without telling you right now. Then we're going to have a good explanation of Rav Ada bar Ava about Rabbi Yeshua's approach, which we kind of mentioned yesterday, and he's going to really explain what is really going on here. They're going to question that, come up with two answers, and then they're going to say, if what you say about Rabbi Yeshua is really true, then these Mishnayot and Kinim don't make any sense. And that's basically going to be where we're going to end in the middle of that whole thing today. Okay, so let's start. We started with this Mishnah, and we're going to go back again. We had all these cases where, again, let's just review. Ola goes on top of the altar. Chatat, in the birds we're talking about, goes at the bottom of the altar. So now, and there's different ways that you do them. Remember, there's haza'ah, sprinkling by the chatat. There's mitzvah only right? Remember, the mitzvah is done in the chatat only at the end, the remainder. But the mitzvah is, the squeezing is the way you do the blood in the ola. And the ola, you cut two simanim. Just to clarify, it was clear after class that I wasn't so clear about this. What we mean by simanim are not simanim of kashrut. Simanim mean it's what we call the trachea and the esophagus, or the two simanim. And in the chatat ha'of, just like actually any slaughtering of a bird that's not the ola, which is the only unique exception to the rule where you actually need to cut both, in a chatat ha'of and regular slaughtering of birds, you only need to cut one siman because it's considered the bird's already dead at that point. Once you cut one of them, it doesn't matter which one, either the trachea or the windpipe. Or the esophagus. Sorry, just said the same thing in two different words. Trachea or esophagus. So now we have Rabbi. So then the Mishnah said, all of these cases, if you do the ola like the chatat or the chatat like the ola, or all these cases where it was pasul, ein matam and beta blia. Now, even though the malika wasn't good, in other words, it wasn't the proper slaughtering, you did it for the wrong sake, the sacrifice is disqualified. But it is enough to say it's not a nevela, okay, which then would have impurity issues. Then the second thing was mo'alim behem. Now, even though it's disqualified, it still has sanctity to it, and therefore you can't use it. But the big chiddush of me'ila is that when it's a chatat, normally the malika permits the bird to be eaten, everything of the bird. So usually that's what happens. In this case, since the meat's not going to be permitted, there's laws of me'ila, meaning it's still all forbidden, and it therefore has the laws of misuse of consecrated property. Now that's the one point that we're going to have a disagreement about Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua in one particular case. Okay, the set analogy that I made yesterday is going to be very helpful today as well, because using the game set as an analogy, it's in that case, right, things are the same, and then you change one thing, things like that, okay, or you change all. So our case we're talking about is where everything's completely off, completely different, and that's, right, like if you had a set where everything was different, the color, the shape, the inside, that everything was the number of how many. That's what we have here. We have an olat ha'of that you do completely wrong, completely like a chatat. Rabbi Yeshua says ein mo'alim, and Rabbi Eliezer says mo'alim. So we started some line of argumentation. Rabbi Eliezer said, what do you mean? If a chatat, where ein bo'alim ba'lishma, where in general there's no me'ila in the end, but yet when you change its name and do it like an ola, there is me'ila. So wouldn't you think the reverse would be true in the ola, where it starts off and it's going to end up having me'ila in general? Just because you switch to a chatat, shouldn't you think like ola's more severe than a chatat? Of course it would still have me'ila. To which Rabbi Yeshua said no, because in the chatat case, you moved it to an ola. In other words, you did it like an ola. And that's why it's going to have me'ila. But in an ola case that you do like a chatat, you actually moved it to something that generally doesn't have laws of me'ila. And that's why it changes to something that doesn't have me'ila. Okay, now we're going to continue. Amar lo Rabbi Eliezer, starting with the top of our daf. Rabbi Eliezer is going to bring a different example. And this is where the set game is going to come into play, because it's going to be how many changes versus how many changes. So He gives an example of koche kochim, sheshachatam b'darom. So wrong place, that's already one thing is off. You're supposed to slaughter high-level sanctity in the north. You did it in the south. Ush chatan l'shem kochim kalim. Two things wrong. You did it for the sake of a shlamim, let's say. Yochichu, that will prove. Now, clearly, everyone agrees. He's saying, you don't disagree with me in this case. There's me'ilah. Even though, theoretically, you moved it to something that normally, what happens with a shlamim? Okay, we're going to see. It's a little complicated. But a shlamim, generally, once you sprinkle the blood, it's permitted to eat. Now, if it's permitted to eat, what's the issue, though? Right? So it's not going to have me'ilah. Anything that's permitted to be eaten doesn't have me'ilah. But there are some parts of it that still remain with me'ilah, but we'll get back to that because what happens, once you sprinkle the blood, certain parts have to be burned on the altar. But let's leave that aside for right now. So now, shekain shinat shmam l'davar she'ein bo me'ilah. So first of all, you switched it to something that doesn't have me'ilah, which was your whole claim, Rabbi Yeshua, that, oh, you took an ola, you did it like a chatat. Chatat doesn't have me'ilah, and that's why this isn't going to have me'ilah. But there, you switched it, you slaughtered it for the sake of a shlamim, which doesn't have me'ilah. And mo'alim behem, but everyone agrees that there's still me'ilah on that korban, because it can't be eaten, right? It was disqualified. It was, right, you took it, you did the wrong place, and you slaughtered l'shem koshim kalim, it's still going to have me'ilah. So, afata al titma la'olah. So why are you so surprised by this olah that you did like a chatat? Afa pisha shinashma l'davar she'ein bo me'ilah. Shi'maluba. So this is the same thing. You changed the same. You did it l'shem chatat, which doesn't have me'ilah. But it should be no different than the koche kochim that you did in the wrong place and, right, for the wrong korban, which is for a korban that doesn't have me'ilah once you sprinkle the blood, and yet it still has me'ilah, so the same thing should be true for our case. Amar lo Rabbi Yeshua. And here is where the set analogy comes into play. Im amarti b'koche kochim shchatam darom shchatam l'shem kochim kalim shekain shinat shmam l'davar sheyesh bo isur veheter. Maybe this isn't exactly the best set example. It's going to come up more in the Braita, so sorry for that. But what did you do here? It's not really the same. You changed the same, and this is what I was talking about before. You turned it into kochim kalim, which in the end, if it was done properly, what would happen? Part of the kochim kalim would have no me'ilah, but part of them still would. That's the heter v'yisur. Part of them are still forbidden because the parts of them are going to be burnt on the altar now. But Tomar Ba'ola Shashinat Shma L'Davar Shekulo Etir. Comes Rabbi Yeshua and he says, well, look, if this chatat had been done properly, it would have been completely permitted to eat. There's no part of it that gets burned on the altar. That's what we said about the chatat. It's a unique thing where the whole bird gets eaten. So you can't compare it to a shlamim where part's going to be eaten, part's not going to be eaten, part's going to still have me'ilah. In this case, none of it's going to have me'ilah. And that's why I think, even though we can't eat the meat of this chatat, but still, I believe that me'ilah is removed because you did change this ola into a chatat, and a chatat never, right, doesn't generally have any me'ilah. I will point out, by the way, there is an opinion among the achronim that you could perhaps even eat this chatat. Okay, and we're going to see in Rav Ad Bar Ava, he basically says that you've taken this ola and you've turned it into a chatat. You basically, by doing everything like a chatat, you basically turned it into a chatat. And then the question is, how far does that go? Does it mean just for purposes of me'ilah? Or does it mean you can even eat the meat? Okay, that's a kind of radical approach, but there is an opinion that says that. But that's not in the Gemara, so we're going to stick to the Gemara. Now, the Gemara doesn't relate to the eating part of it. Tana. So now we have a Braita. That's the end of the Mishnah. Now we're going to have a Braita with a back and forth. Amar lo Rabbi Eliezer lo Rabbi Yeshua. It's going to be similar, and here's where set comes into play, because we're going to keep changing one parameter or another one or something like that. So he starts off with an asham. Now an asham is koche kochim, so it's very parallel to the Mishnah, but instead of shachato b'darom, he starts off with shachato b'tzafon, where he actually did it in the right place. So asham shachato b'tzafon l'shem shlamim yochiach. So you did it in the north, which was right, but you did it l'shem shlamim, which was wrong. Sheshinat shmo u'mo'alim bo. Now here you changed its name, and yet there's still a law of me'ilah. Afatal titma la'olah. It's going to be the same words all the time. So why are you so surprised by this olah? In others, why do you claim with the olah it's different? It goes into a chatat. She'afa pisha shinat shma she'imaluba. Just because you changed its name and said, oh, I'm doing this olah like a chatat, it shouldn't change the fact, it shouldn't permit me'ilah, basically, and say this isn't, right, there's no obligation of me'ilah anymore, because it's just like the asham. Obviously, it's not just like the asham, because Amar lo Rabbi Yeshua. Lo, mamarta ba'asham, she'im shinat shmo, Lo shinat mikamo. You gave me a really bad example. There was only one change. All you did was change it to a shlamim. You didn't change its place or anything else. So tomar ba'ola, but what's our case? We have shinat shma, vishinat mikoma. Now we even have more than that. But right now he's just saying, I have two changes versus your one change. You gave me one change. All you did was change the name of it. What was the sake of the korban was a different korban. And I'm going to tell you, my ola, you did number one, you changed it to a chatat. Number two, you did it up above instead of, you did it below instead of above. Now, at the top part of the altar. Amar lo Rabbi Eliezer. Fine. I'll give you another example. Now we get to the example that was already in the Mishnah. And you understand, these are parallel sources, so there's sometimes overlap. Asham sheshachato b'darom l'shem shlamim yochiach. Okay, so fine. I'll give you another example. And what it means here is if we take this bright as this is the real version, it means that with the Mishnah, right, that was he got there after he was already a different one. The Mishnah just chose only the more stronger argument. So Asham sheshachato b'darom. I'll change the place. You want place change and sake of, for what sake it was done? Fine, I'll give you an example. Asham sheshachato b'darom l'shem shlamim yochiach sheshinat shmo v'shinat mikamo. So here you have a change of name and you have a change of location. Umo'alimbo, and we know there's mi'ila there. Afata al titma'al ola. So why are you so surprised by this ola and why are you changing your tone on it? Sha'af al pi sheshinat shma v'shinat mikoma. Even though you changed the name to a chatat and you changed its place, you did it below instead of above. Ma'alimbo, you should still have mi'ila. Amar lo Rabbi Yeshua. No, it's not two changes, it's three changes, right? Ima marta ba'asham sheshinat shmo v'shinat mikamo. So you gave me an example in Asham with only two changes. You change its name and you change the location. But lo shinat ma'asav, but they're slaughtered in the same exact way. There's no difference in the way you slaughter them or sprinkle the blood. Tomar ba'ola. But in ola, what do we learn here? It's l'shem chatat, right? In the makom chatat and the maaseh chatat. You did the actions like the chatat. Tomar ba'ola sheshinat shma ve'et maaseh vishinat mikoma. Right? And you did the malika, only one siman and not two, and lo hivdil. Okay, end of conversation. Now comes Rav and he said, why did the conversation end here? If I were Rabbi Eliezer, I would have been able to go on. So basically he says, and he assumes, if I figured this out, Rabbi Eliezer obviously also could have figured this out. So basically what he's saying is, okay, Rabbi Yeshua wanted three changes. He said, three changes versus your two changes. But let's come up with three changes by the Asham. Very easy. Here's a new change. You could say it was done in the south, it was done for the sake of shlamim, and it was done with the intent of the different owner. Okay, so instead of doing it for Reuven, he did it for Shimon. Sheshinat shmo, v'shinat mikamo, v'shinat maasav. Now comes Rav and he says, I'm going to deduce something. Midelo ka'amar lehachi, from the fact that he didn't say that, must mean Shma mina nachi Rabbi Eliezer l'tamei de Rabbi Yeshua. Must mean that Rabbi Eliezer came around and agreed with Rabbi Yeshua. Very radical, right? Because nowhere else seems to indicate that. So he deduces just from the fact that he didn't say that must mean that he must have agreed with him in the end. To Amar Rav Ad bar Ava. Now this seems to say that this Rav Ad bar Ava you assume is going to prove that Rabbi Eliezer changed his mind, but it doesn't, okay? But it does explain the logic of Rabbi Yeshua and perhaps explains that maybe Rabbi Eliezer didn't get his logic until finally he realized. And then maybe he came around. So it's not 100% clear why this is de Amar, as is said. But this is going to be a big central line. De Amar Rav Ad bar Ava. Omer haya Rabbi Yeshua. Ola ta'of she'asa lamata k'maseh chatat l'shem chatat. That's our case. You took the ola of a bird. Again, what does it mean it's an ola of a bird? It means I designated the bird to be an ola. And then the Kohen went ahead, did it. L'shem chatat. In the place of the chatat. And like the chatat is done. And he switches it over. So now he says, here's the big line. If you did that, kevan shemalak ba siman echad, nimshechet v'naaset chatat ha'of. Since malika is done by only one siman in the chatat ha'of, as soon as you take this bird and you do this maaseh of malika, and everything else is like a chatat, your intent was chatat, everything was a chatat. As soon as you do that slaughtering of one siman, you basically turned it into a chatat. And this is why I said before, there's this debate among the achronim, does that mean you could even eat it? Is it completely a chatat? Or is it just for the purposes of me'ila that we're going to say, right, that there's no me'ila anymore? Okay, but either which way, we're basically saying it morphs into a chatat, either 100% completely or mostly completely. Right? Maybe we still don't allow the kohen to eat the meat, but the bird, but okay, that's his theory. So now the Gemara has a question on this, and then we're going to have a whole bunch of questions from Kinim. But the first question is, Ihachi, well, if you can say that if I took the olat ha'of, and I basically did it all like a chatat, and it turns into a chatat, why wouldn't you say the reverse when it comes to an ola? And if you notice in the Mishnah, Rabbi Yoshua only spoke about one case, the ola that becomes a chatat. So Ihachi, chatat ha'of nami sha'asa lamala k'maaseh ola. You should say the same thing, the chatat ha'of that you do lamala, which is where the ola goes. K'maaseh ola, and you start doing it like the ola. Michi malik ba siman echad timashech b'david ola ta'of. Why don't we say that as you're doing the malika, it morphs into an olat ha'of because you're doing the whole thing for olat ha'of. The chitei machinami, and if you want to say yes, he actually does hold that way, well, we're going to have a problem with that. Why? V'ha'amar Rabbi Yochanan mishum Rabbi Bena'ah. Rabbi Yochanan says, name Rabbi Bena'ah, kach yatza'ah shel Mishnah. This is what the Mishnah says, that's what it is. Meaning, my love, does this not mean kach yatza'ah v'tulo? That this is the Mishnah and no other case. In other words, it's only this case, there's no other case where Rabbi Yeshua disagrees. But the Gemara says, no, that's not such a difficulty. My love, lo. Kach hatza'ah shel kula Mishnah. Option number one to explain this difficulty, if he says it by ola that can morph into a chatat, why don't you say it about a chatat that can morph into an ola? Option number one is to say you can. And what do we do with the statement, this is the Mishnah and nothing else? No, that's not really what it meant. It meant this is the Mishnah, meaning Rabbi Yeshua is complete in this opinion. He says it even in other cases, okay? He says it even in the reverse case. Meaning this is a paradigm for if you take something and you do it completely wrong, it's going to morph into it. Now, there's only two cases anyway, but that's what he means, that he disagrees with all the cases, really. Okay, even though it doesn't really say that in the Mishnah, that's option one. Rav Ashi, I think, is a little more convincing, at least my own personal opinion. Rav Ashi is going to say, no, there's a difference. And he's going to explain why there's a difference. Why can an ola morph into a chatat, but a chatat can't morph into an ola? And it all goes back to the first Mishnah. Remember the first Mishnah? Chatat sha'asa shelo lishma, pasul. Ola sha'asa shelo lishma works, but it just doesn't work for the obligation. So now we have an ola that was done shelo, right, l'shem chatat, and we have a chatat that was done l'shem ola. So now you can see where he's going to go. Bishlama olata of sha'asa against Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi amar. Bishlama olata of sha'asa lamata k'masa chatat l'shem chatat. That whole case where you have an ola and you do it all down below, like the chatat, all that. Kevan. Now there's a few reasons why this difference is. Kevan sh'deha hachshera b'siman echad v'ha hachshera b'shnei simanim. If you were slaughtering an ola, you'd have to do two simanim. If you're slaughtering the chatat, you only need to, or malika to the chatat, you'd only have to do one. So now you took this bird that you're doing at the bottom. Now the assumption is when you do malika, you're going to first do the first siman, right? Let's say the trachea. Then you'll do the esophagus, okay? So you'll do one and then the other. So as soon as you do one, that's already, you did it with the mind you're doing a chatat, and you did it like a chatat because you did one siman. So, and you did it lamata. So, olat ha'of lamata leita. In other words, there is no such thing as an olat ha'of down at the bottom either. That's another thing. There's three differences. One is you do the simanim, right? Two simanim for the ola, one for the chatat. And at this point, you've done one. You're like in the middle of doing it. You already do one. At that point, number two, you can't do an ola at the bottom. It's never good. So that's number two. Number three, olata of lamata leita. V'kevan demalak lasiman echad nimshecha v'naseh chatat of. Number three, it doesn't say it, but you do it shelo lishma. It's not disqualified. So basically, you took this ola, you did it l'shem chatat, which means it's okay sacrifice, and you did it like a chatat, and you did it in a place where you can't do the ola. So that case, we're going to say it works. But chatat of, let's do the reverse with those three differences. First of all, malika b'chomakom shecha. If you remember, we learned that the malika of the chatat, even though the chatat is done at the bottom, the malika could be done anywhere on the altar, just not the sprinkling. So when you do the malika on top of the altar, now you take an chatat, you do it on top, l'shem ola. So now, when does lishma kick in? During the shechita, right? Or in this case, during the malika. So while you're being molek this bird, shelo lishma, michimalik basiman echad pasla. Now, if you're doing it like a chatat, as soon as you do one siman, you already completed the malika. And at that point, you've done it l'shem, right? You took your chatat, which really only needed one siman. You did it l'shem ola, and you did it, so up above doesn't bother us, because that's okay. But, so it actually is kshera. It's like a chatat that's kshera right now, because you did it above, and theoretically you could do it above. And you did one siman. So once it could be a chatat, a malika of a chatat, and you did it, that one siman, but you had a thought, I'm doing it l'shem ola. So you basically completed the shchita of a chatat by doing one siman with a lo lishma thought. So at that moment, you've disqualified it. So now remember, you're doing the chatat like an ola. So what are you going to do your next step? You're going to completely slaughter the animal. You're going to do the second siman. Hadr malik be'idach siman, when you now do malika on the second siman, and the whole theory was maybe it'll turn into an ola. Well, it's obviously too late. Because how can you now move it to a lot of? It was already disqualified. You disqualified it after the first siman. So there is it's not possible to do a maaseh olah on a chatat of without already disqualifying it. Because remember, since it can be done anywhere on the altar, so it's actually a valid shchita for a chatat, or a valid malika. So when you do that one siman, it's a valid malika. The problem is you did it lo lishma and you disqualified the sacrifice. Once it's disqualified, you can't say, oh, well, I slaughtered both now and I did it like an ola. It's impossible. That's why I think he's pretty convincing. Okay. Now we get to the more complicated part of today's daf. Not that was easy. But, ready? Okay. Gufa. Now we're going back to the statement. Amar Rav Bar Ava. Omer haya Rabbi Yeshua, olat ha'of she'asa'ah lamata, k'maseh chatat l'shem chatat. Okay, since already now talked about this a lot. You take the ola. You do it like a chatat. All the things like a chatat. In the bottom, like a chatat. Kevan shemalach basiman echad, nimshechet v'naseh chatat ha'of. Okay, once you do one siman, you basically turned it into a chatat ha'of. And that's why it doesn't have me'ilah. That's Rabbi Yeshua, and that's the way Rav Bar Ava understands Rabbi Yeshua. Now we're going to bring up the presentation. Okay, it's about birds. Okay, now Tashma. We're going to bring two difficulties on this from Mishnayot and Kini. So the first Mishnah is a Mishnah that says, okay, we have two women, Ruth and Naomi. Okay, Ruth and Naomi, we'll call them in English. Now, sorry that I didn't have a chance to do the presentation in English, but be happy there's a presentation, so we'll be happy with that. Now, each woman, let's just talk about generally women who give birth. That's the classic case. A woman's going to bring a pair of birds. Brings a pair of birds. Okay, she actually can bring an animal and a bird, but lots of times the typical example of two birds is a woman who gives birth. So we have, let's say, these two women after childbirth. They each brought a pair of birds to the temple. And each one, when you bring these pair of birds, is for an ola and a chatat. In this case, we're kind of midway in the story. Okay, there were 4 birds originally, now there's only 2. The Kohen already did one for one and one for the other, and the opposite. Okay, so now we're left with 2 birds. Naomi needs a chatat. So Naomi needs a chatat, Ruth needs an ola. Okay, so we have these 2 birds. We don't know whose is whose. Okay, we don't know which is which. Now, if we know who was whose, we know which one it was. We know this was the ola for Ruth, and this is the chatat for Naomi. But we don't know. The 2 birds got mixed up, right? You can imagine also why birds get mixed up. They fly around, right? We don't know. Okay. The Kohen he just goes ahead and does it. What does he do? So we're going to have 3 scenarios. Either he does shtehen lamala. He took both those birds and did them both on top. Now, if that's the case, what happens? Well, mechza kasher, mechza pasul. One's going to be kosher, one's not going to be kosher. Ruth is going to fulfill her obligation because it was done on top. On top, we assume that's an ola. And the chatat that was done on top, is obviously disqualified. Okay. Second scenario. The Kohen does both below. Shtein lamata. Mechza kasher, mechza pasul, same thing, but it's going to be the reverse. Naomi is going to fulfill her obligation of the sin offering because it was done at the bottom, and the sin offering, the chatat's done at the bottom. So we're going to assume this bird, let's say, was the chatat, and then that one maybe was the ola, and it's disqualified. It doesn't work, so we're moving on. What if, though, the Kohen decided, I have one ola, one chatat, so let's do one above and one below. Chat lamala ve'chat lamata. Shtehen psulot. Why? Shani omel. Because you could say, we don't know. The whole thing is we have no idea. Is this one a chatat? Is that one a chatat? Is this one an ola? Is that one an ola? Well, right, in the best case scenario, you'd say, oh, maybe he took the Ola one and did it on top and the Chatat one and on the bottom. But we don't know that. Maybe Chatat kreva lamala, ve'ola kreva lamata. Maybe he took the Chatat and he did the Chatat up above, which is disqualified, and did the Ola down below, which is disqualified. Here comes our question. You ready? So in that case, no woman fulfills her obligation. But here's the koshi on Rav Ada. Nihi nami de Ola kreva lamata. If you say that an Ola that goes lamata, for the sake of a Chatat, with the actions of a Chatat, all that, becomes a Chatat, timshoch v'tehave Chatat ha'of. Then this bird that we did at the bottom, Naomi should actually fulfill her obligation here for the Chatat, because, okay, the one done at the top, there's nothing to do about it. That's what we said, unless you take that opinion that he would say the same in the reverse. But right now, we're not assuming that. We're going with Rav Ashi, that he doesn't say it in the Ola case. So with a Chatat that was done above, in other words, again, the top, one done at the top could be an Ola, but it could have been a Chatat that was done like an Ola, and that's not going to work. But the one done at the bottom, either it was the Chatat, in which case it's completely great, or it's the Ola, but remember, the Kohen did it down below. What does it mean he did it down below? The Kohen treated it like it was a Chatat. So he did it L'Shem Chatat, he did it K'maaseh Chatat. So according to Rabbi Yeshua, this should be totally fine. And it's not, right? Because it said clear, Naomi does not fulfill her obligation. So if Rav Ada bar Ava was right, that this is Rabbi Yeshua's position, that you can take a Chatat and you took an Ola that turned into a Chatat, and you did it like a Chatat, becomes a Chatat, this should work, and at least Naomi shall fulfill her obligation. So what's the answer? Okay, we don't have a chart for this. What was Rabbi Yeshua's case? Rabbi Yeshua's case was when I brought a korban, let's say, and then the Kohen messed up and did it in the wrong place, okay, and did it for the sake of the wrong korban, all that, okay, he took my Ola and he did like a Chatat. So then we can say, fine, it'll fulfill my obligation anyway. But we can't say that maybe this bird doesn't even belong to Naomi. Maybe it's Ruth's bird. You can't say, oh, let's take Ruth's bird and turn it into a Chatat for Naomi. That's not possible. Makes a lot of sense. So this is not actually a difficulty. Okay. Next case, Tashma. Okay, you can already see this is a little more complicated. So now the first thing you have to know before we even start reading it is that we have this time, okay, you can see from the picture, 6 birds, 3 sets of birds. Okay, they always come in pairs. So there's 3 pairs of birds here. I mean, they don't have to. Remember, you said we could bring an individual, but we're talking here about 3 pairs of birds. Now, in this case, Naomi has to bring a sin offering, which is bringing a bird, and she also has a pair of a Chatat and an Ola, a pair of birds, Chatat and Ola. She has 3 birds to bring. It could be like the previous case where she had 2 Olas and Chatats and 1 Ola was brought. Okay, for whatever reason, she has 2 sin offerings to bring and a burnt offering. And Ruth has the reverse. She has 2 burnt offerings she needs to bring and 1 sin offering. And they both bring these 6 birds together, okay, like they're partners, and they bring the 6 birds to fulfill their obligation. Okay? So in these pairs of birds, we have 3 Olas and 3 Chatats, right? It's Ola Chatat, Ola Chatat, Ola Chatat, which basically covers all the things they need. But they're going to break into categories. We're going to have each pair, which is called a cane, that's why it's called Masechet Kinim. Each nest, right, literally means a nest, but it's really a pair. Each pair of birds has a different status of it right now, or not. What do we know about it? So the first pair, we know that the Ola is Naomi's, and the Chatat is Ruth's. Okay, we know, we have a fact, that's called Chatat v'Ola. We know one's the Chatat of this one, and the Ola of the other one. Okay, it doesn't really matter Ruth Naomi, I just randomly chose. Stuma, the next one, none of the birds were chosen yet. Now this is important, okay? I don't think I mentioned this yet. The way the birds work is either when I have a pair of birds I need to bring, let's say I gave birth and I bring a pair of birds, I can decide I want this one to be an Ola, this one to be a Chatat, okay? I can also just bring a pair of birds and have the Kohen decide. So in the first case, we had already decided and chosen who was, we knew whose was whose, and we knew which was which. The second pair has no name to it, okay? We don't know if it's Ruth's or Naomi's, and it wasn't given specification. That's important. It's not just we don't know. It wasn't. It's blank, okay? So that means it's going to be very easy to fill in which is which. Because when the Kohen sacrifices it, he can decide which is which. So if he's going to put one above, one below, that's going to automatically designate that the one above is the Ola and the one below is the Chatat, because he has the power to do that. But only if the women didn't choose. In the first pair they chose, and in the second pair they chose, and the third pair they chose. The next one is Mefuresha. That's the opposite. Stuma is it's flat, like nobody decided anything yet. It's empty, blank slate. Mefureshet is they decided. One is an Ola, one is a Chatat, and as they knew. The problem is, we don't know who the Ola belongs to, we don't know who the Chatat belongs to. So we have three different scenarios. In one, we know Ola, Chatat, and who it belongs to. In the second, we have a pair that we don't have anything. We don't know who it belongs to, and it's totally unaffiliated with any offering. And the third, we know it's affiliated with an offering, but we don't know who it's affiliated with. Okay, let's see what happens now. So again, we're going to go through all our scenarios. The Kohen brings them all lamala. Okay, that's scenario one. So now, okay, by accident, the Chatat and Ola came off here, but okay, so now. In this case, since Naomi's was an Ola, okay, sorry, that got deleted. Naomi's was an Ola, the one we knew that was Naomi's. So her Ola, she gets, she's Yotzei Idei Chovah. And obviously, Ruth's two Olas also, because whatever, all the birds are up on top. So at least three of them are Olot, and they're going to, right, all fulfill their obligations. But nobody's going to, right, so Asa Kulan Lamala, Mechza Kasher, Mechza Pasul. Half are kosher, the Olas they got. The Chatats are Psulim, there's nothing to do about them. Kulan Lamata, it's going to be the reverse, right? The same thing, but in reverse. Mechza Kasher, Mechza Pasul. All the Chatat obligations are going to be fulfilled, but none of the Olas. What if you do Chetzian Lamala v'Chetzian Lamata? Eina Kshera Ela Stuma u'mitchaleket benehem. This is what I said before, which is the Stuma one. Because the Stuma one is basically able to be decided by the Kohen where to do it, so the one he brought above and below is of the one that was blank, we're going to say, the top one was Ola, the bottom was Chatat. So basically we're going to be able to say, one fulfilled an obligation for a Chatat, one fulfilled an obligation for an Ola. Now, how do we know? Maybe they both belong to Naomi, or maybe they both belong to Ruth. How can we decide? Well, they say, mitchaleket benehem, we split it 50-50. In other words, one gets a Chatat, one gets an Ola. And why is that? Because, now, remember what I said at the beginning. You might not remember this, but they went in together. Okay? They put all their money together and said, we're buying these birds together. So they were partners in it. So the one that's going to work, we're going to split it 50-50. Now, here comes the difficulty. Ilum Meforashim lo, well, why not the Meforashim? The ones that said Chatat and Ola, and theoretically also the one that we knew whose Chatat it was, whose Ola it was. Well, the one that we knew they had now, what can you say about, in other words, the two bottom ones? So now, remember what Rabbi Yoshua says. We already said, right, one's going to be an Ola, one's going to be a Chatat, the two blank ones. But now we have two more that were done at the bottom. There could be Chatats, right? Because if you do an Ola, Amai, Nami, de Ola Kreva Lamata, if you say that an Ola that's done Lamata, like a Chatat, for the name of a Chatat, obviously when the Kohen did 3 above and 3 below, he obviously meant that the 3 below are going to be sin offerings. So why don't you just say, either they happen to be the ones that happen to be Chatats, and it works, or you say, it's an Ola, it was supposed to be an Ola, but if he did it as a Chatat, you should be able to make it into a Chatat. And now we don't have the problem of it's someone else's because they each are obligated Chatats, and as you cover everybody here. So theoretically, you should, okay, I didn't put it here like I did in the other one, but the Chatat of Naomi and the Chatat of Ruth, both those Chatats that have X's by them, theoretically, if Rabbi Yeshua, if Rav Ada bar Ava's explanation of Rabbi Yeshua is right, it should work. Okay, to which the Gemara says, why not? Well, v'chi tema ha de lo ka Rabbi Yeshua. Maybe, okay, they're not going to really answer this question. What they're going to say is, maybe you'll just say this Mishnah doesn't follow Rabbi Yeshua. Remember, he argues with Rabbi Eliezer. Now, we did seem to say that maybe Rabbi Eliezer agreed in the end, but you could say this Mishnah was said like the opinion that disagrees with him. What's the problem with that? Okay, this starts a whole long thing, which we'll only get started on today. Can you really say that? Because we're now going to start a whole slew of Mishnayot. Okay? Tashma, let's learn from here. And we're going to go through a whole bunch of Mishnayot and Kinim, which really aren't necessary to go through. You might say, oh, too bad, because this is quite complicated. But the reason why we're going through this is for the end, which is going to come up on next on the next daf, which is Rabbi Yeshua pipes in at the end there, which seems to indicate this is all Rabbi Yeshua, all these Mishnayot. Okay? So that's where we're bringing this. So let's just start with this first case. We have a woman who says, Hare alai kain im eled zachar. So Naomi gets up and says, if she makes a neder, if I have a boy, if I give birth to a boy, I'm going to bring a pair of birds as a burnt offering. This is a voluntary burnt offering. You can't bring sin offerings voluntarily. So she's bringing a burnt offering of a neder, and then yalda zachar, and then she has a male. So now she has to fulfill the olas for her neder, and she has to fulfill the birth ones. So she has one pair that's going to be a chatat and an ola, and one pair that's just going to be 2 olot, because if you remember, right, you bring the same, first of all, it has to be the same type of bird. I'm going to get into that soon. So she needs 2 kinim, 2 pairs of birds, one for her neder, one for her obligation of Leda. So now she gives it to the Kohen, Netanatan the Kohen, and the Kohen messes up. What's the Kohen supposed to do? Very simply, she has 3 olas, 1 chatat, so it's pretty basic. He needs to do 3 lamala ve'echat lamata, 3 on top, 1 below. What's the problem? Well, the problem is we have a woman after childbirth, and she brought 2 pairs of birds. The Kohen assumes there are some cases where a woman has to bring 2 for, let's say, 2 births. She could have had a miscarriage just before and now not made it to the temple and now doing another. There's all sorts of scenarios. And he just assumes she brought 2 birds. She's bringing 2 olas and 2 chatats, okay? So he does, lo asaken, he doesn't do what he's supposed to, 3 above, 1 below. He does 2 above and 2 below. Vilonim lach, and he didn't ask anyone, he just did it, okay? So what does she have to do now? So let's figure this out, okay? But what it says is here, tzricha shetavi od preda achat v'takrivena lamala minin echad. Okay, because what happens here? Let's just go through first. So 2 olas above, so we can put a V, right? A check by the Leda ola and the Neder ola, because those 2 were done above. At the bottom, she did 2 chatats. Now 1 chatat is no good because she only needed to do 1 chatat. So 1 chatat she gets a check for. So she's basically done her Leda, chatat and ola. So this pair, let's say, chatat and ola. Then she has to bring, right, I should have put an X through this one, okay? But imagine there's an X here. Then she has to bring 1 more ola because she's missing an ola. So she brings a 3rd ola and fulfills her obligation, okay? Now, lo asaken, aval asa, okay, now this is the same thing, but mishnei minim, tavishtayim. Okay, here I didn't do the picture well enough. I just ran out of time before I finished. I'll try to go after class and finish it up and do it right. But if she brought, oh, that's why, I know. This page is just unnecessary. Sorry, that's the issue. Okay, if she did mishnei minim, I did the picture, okay, tavishtayim. Let's say she promised she was going to bring, okay, she brought 2 different types of birds, but we don't know which one she promised for her neder. Okay, so she picked a certain pair, but we don't know which kind it was, because remember, there's tolim and there's b'nei yonah. Okay, there's pigeons and there's turtle doves. So what happens now? So the problem is we also don't know. There's a lot of things we don't know. We don't know which one the Kohen did first. Now, the obvious assumption is when the Kohen first takes a pair and he does 1 above, 1 below, since the Kohen thought it was all for birth, that's going to count for her birth. So if he took 1 above, 1 below, okay, at first, that's your ola, that's your chatat for birth. He covers Naomi's birth, korbanot, no problem. Then he takes the other ones, okay, he takes the pigeons, and he brings them also, right? He brings them 1 above, 1 below. So the 1 below, here's where I made the X. The 1 below doesn't count for anything. The 1 above counts for an ola. What's the problem? Well, if she really promised pigeons, then she adds another pigeon, okay? And that's good. That's only 1. So how do we get to 2? Well, because we don't know which the Kohen did first. What if he first brought the pigeons? And then, in other words, either she needs another pigeon, or if he brought the pigeons first, and then brought the doves, then what happens? In that case, she's going to need to add one more dove, okay? Because again, she's going to be short 1 ola. In each case, she's going to be short 1 ola. We just don't know which one. So since in the end there were 2 olot, 1 was a pigeon and 1 was a dove, and we don't know which one was for which, right? Which one she promised for her Ola offering. So she's going to basically have to bring a pigeon and a dove, because it'll either be filled in with the pigeon or it'll be filled in with the dove. One will be just unnecessary, and right, it will be just an extra voluntary offering, and with that way she'll fulfill her obligation. Okay, that's what we're going to end today. We're kind of in mid-situation because we haven't really figured out how this connects to Rabbi Yeshua at all, right? This was all about why we're bringing this Mishnah. Well, we're bringing it, okay, again, I'll remind you. Let's just review the second part of today's daf, and then we'll go back to the beginning. But after Rav Ada bar Ava said that Rabbi Yeshua held this olat ha'of, that you turn into a chatat, basically takes on, right, when you do everything like a chatat, it becomes a chatat. So we had these two Mishnayot that we brought in Kinim, that each seemed to show we don't hold like Rabbi Yeshua because we ignore the one down at the bottom that theoretically could have been an olah, it was on a chatat, or could have just been a chatat. Why don't we say it works either which way? And the first reason was because there were two women, and that didn't work. But the second case, where that was an issue because they were together, they were partners, so theoretically that could have worked for the two women, but it didn't work perhaps because the Mishnah doesn't go like Rabbi Yeshua. And then we said, but wait, how can you say the Mishnah doesn't go like Rabbi Yeshua? Because of blah, 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 which we're going to get to. So we're in the middle of the set of Mishnayot we're going to read, and we'll finish them up tomorrow. Okay, so that was the end part of the daf, and the beginning part of the daf was obviously this machloka between Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Eliezer about is there me'ilah in that case that we just discussed. And because, again, if you say it becomes a chatat, then there's actually no me'ilah anymore, according to Rabbi Yeshua. And we had a lot of back and forth between them, each one trying to prove their point. Rabbi is convinced that Rabbi Eliezer was convinced and moved over to Rabbi Yeshua's side from the fact that in the version we had in the Breita, he didn't offer a counter argument, which he could have made. And basically, we also had to ask, we have one other thing, which we asked about, what about the reverse? Why isn't the reverse true? If that's really what Rav bar Ava thinks, then why don't we just say that he holds the same thing with a chatat that's done like an olah? And either, maybe he does. That was option one. Option two was, no, the chatat that's done like an olah is completely disqualified as soon as you do the one siman, right? Because of all the differences, it actually becomes disqualified before it can even turn into an olah. So you can't have it turn into an olah if it's already disqualified beforehand, because it's a chatat that you did l'shem olah, which would disqualify it as soon as you finish the shechita, which happens only at the first siman, and you haven't yet done the maaseh olah. So because of that, it's going to be disqualified. With that, we finish for today. Hope you have nice dreams about birds, and we will meet up tomorrow and finish this sugya.